סוגר את הדלת. אודי. Yes. We can't. It's a surprise event. You're not going to suffer. You must have suffered throughout the day, but this is not. Okay, yalla. Yalla. Okay. So, Liad Mudrik, really. I will put you in the corner. You can't be talking. We need to start. I'm kidding. It's all about Lucia. You should have said yes. We have a surprise event, and as you know, the six of us were here for a few months. And Rafi Malach, our good friend, he's kind of shy, and he was never willing to ask questions and to talk. And so we decided, how can we make him talk? So this is the surprise event. Let's make Rafi talk. But more seriously, Rafi is retiring this year. Closing your lab? No closing his lab, but retiring. And we thought it's worth a celebration. So we asked someone who knows how to ask people questions to talk to Rafi for an hour about life, recommendations for good living, Tel Aviv, and other sort of stuff. So I really thank Liad for agreeing to do this, Liad and Rafi. You might want to, do you want to use the mics?
To say something, to actually make an apology before we start, because I imagine that Mike Shadlan, for example, when he heard about the surprise, was hoping there will be some jazz session here or some dancing, and instead he gets another two Israelis talking their heads off about. So I really apologize. It's all Leon's and Ran's idea. And we'll try to be as entertaining as possible, but I have no idea what I'm going to say. So.
Okay, so to be honest, I was kind of.
That's a first surprise.
Yeah, so I wasn't sure about whether we should do this or not, and whether I should go into the role of asking questions in a scientific conference where I prefer to ask questions, but scientific ones. But in this case, I thought it's worthwhile to make the exception because what I think everyone in this room feels about you. So I'm happy for the privilege to have this hour with you. And you probably don't remember, but I think the first time we were in a similar situation was about 13 years ago or 14 years ago. I was I think my first year of my PhD or something, and there was a meeting in Weizmann where I don't remember how this happened, but I found myself sitting with you and other scientists talking about the mind and body problem, and you guys didn't want to answer any of my questions because you just didn't want to commit to any stand about this question, and I can understand why. So I promise you that today I won't ask you about the mind-body problem or ask you to define what consciousness is or what is consciousness in the brain. But I do want to ask you, why do you think this question is so intriguing for all of us? So why this question being so hard to study and having so many difficulties in interpreting the results and understanding what it means, how come we all do it? And how come you did it for so many years, or do it for so many years?
We heard today many comments that maybe this problem is mundane or not very easy, not too, there's no magic in it. And I'm talking here now pure emotions, nothing intellectual. I'm obsessed with this, I will call it miracle. I don't know any other word to say it. You take a jelly in a bucket, which is our head, you pass electrical signals, millions of them, trillions of them, I don't care, And suddenly the jelly tells you that they see the sunset on the beach in Gordon Beach in Tel Aviv. And I think, to me, this is mind-boggling phenomena. You know, we are all in the trenches and fighting and confounds and artifacts and statistics on that. If you walk back and you ask yourself, what's going on here? Now, this is not sunset of somebody else. This is my sunset that is generated by these electrical pulses in the brain. I think there is no other words to describe it except mind-boggling, amazing phenomena of nature, and I think we should all be obsessed in studying it, although of course it is incredibly challenging and a lot of artifacts and we'll never know the answer and we cannot define it. But let's go just for a moment and take some step back and see how amazing this challenge that we are studying. And I think no wonder for 5 months our group were arguing forever on every aspect, including lunches, including coffee breaks. We never stopped. I think this is an indication of how fascinating this question is. We'll never solve it, but it's still fascinating.
But do you remember the day the obsession began? Like, do you remember when you decided that this is something you want to pursue?
No, actually, the way, you know, it's an interesting question because we heard about here reinstating the history. So I realized that I started actually studying it without knowing. I want to take you back 26 years ago because I was fortunate. I want to describe the landscape without fMRI around. You know, so I was basically doing monkey anatomy track tracing, and no way you could think about consciousness. This was not for serious scientists. This was for philosophers. And I'm getting an email from, maybe you know him, Roger Tutel in MGH. And he writes to me, you know, that this new cool technique, you put somebody in a magnet and you can get area MT lighting up. And I said, what? What did he take? Might mention THC in the coffee. I mean, what is going on there? This complete bullshit. Because I was aware, you know, with EEG recordings, how much averaging you need to do and the inability to localize. But I said I had my sabbatical coming on. I said I'll drop by MGH, realize it's all bullshit, and I'll just continue hiking in the snow and all that. I come to MGH. They were just doing retinotopic mapping of all the visual hierarchy, and Roger's student shows me the vertical and horizontal activation one after another. In 20 minutes, these guys were mapping the entire visual hierarchy that it took in monkey optical imaging months to achieve such a resolution. I was watching it and I said, this is mind-boggling again. And I felt, you know, this paranoid feeling as if the earth, like there is a crowd of elephants about to, you know, run us over, because the moment this knowledge about this amazing technique, at that time we didn't know anything about, you know, mapping in the brain. Now it's so common, again, that we are all used to it and take it for granted. At that time, just having a person in the magnet and following all the organization of the visual areas in 20 minutes, half an hour of mapping was powerful beyond belief. And it was obvious to me there will be like 50,000. No, you didn't need a lot of predictive imagination to realize how powerful and how everybody will run on it. So I was saying I have to start running right away to do an experiment. And maybe I'll say the first experiment, because I think it was a great disappointment. But I think you learn, and I will if we're talking about what can we learn, you know, from our experiment, and I'm curious in the audience how much you learn from your failures, you know. And I think the way I got to my understanding of consciousness was through a series of failures and disappointments in the research. And somehow I tend to believe my failures more than my success, because when you are trying to get something and you fail and you get something else, then you know that really the brain is talking to you and you're not imposing your ideas on the brain. So I want to describe to you, so I have this tool, and Roger asked me, okay, what experiment shall we do? He was studying MT. To me, it sounded engineering. I wanted the magic of recognition, perception, and all that. And I said, I have this great idea. We'll immediately find the recognition center in the human brain. The idea is very, very simple. You take pictures of famous people, you show them upright, you show them inverted. Everybody knows that when you invert a familiar face, it's very difficult to recognize you. So we have here on recognition, off recognition. Obviously, the brain will light up for the upright and not for the inverted. And in 2 weeks, I have a science paper and I'm going home happy. So I'm running the experiment, nothing, no difference. Big activation in the area that is now called LOC. No change between upright and inverted faces, despite the fact that there is a major change in perceptual experience. So this was the first disappointment, that finding correlation between experience and brain activity is not a very straightforward discovery. And at that time I got into an obsession, and I said I must find what is inactive or not activating this ventral stream lateral occipital complex. I tried 40 experiments, I counted, in which I tried every possible object category, faces, abstract sculptures, drawings, everything that had an object in it activated LOC very highly. There were, of course, subtle differences. We all now studying them, face-related regions, but they are all kind of subtle effects. The general effect in these areas is a major activation to all possible objects. And I was desperate. Roger was doing this thing of moving and stationary, beautiful modulation of activation in MT. Ventral stream doesn't care what you're showing him. It sounded crazy. And then I was thinking, what could be something that is not an object? You know, what can? And it turned out to me that the tapetes on the walls, you know, the texture patterns are the things that look flat. They don't look like three-dimensional objects. I said, let's try them.
Did it happen consciously or unconsciously?
That's requiring Ran Hassin here to explain. Suddenly you have this idea, and I ran it, beautiful. Suddenly, LOC doesn't like patterns. It responds only to object. And the moment you have this kind of selectivity, you opened up a field. You can do zillions of things and move from there on. But this disappointing of having the inversion not working, I think, prevented me from realizing how powerful fMRI be in relating brain activity to conscious perception. And then eventually I got it at the Weizmann Institute to explore it.
But when did conscious perception per se became the object of research?
So the way it was done is the following. You have this tool called MRI, which basically at first we treated it as if it's a toy. No controls, no worrying about you. have this enormous machine that is mapping the brain. You don't care about anything, and you just say, okay, let's try. And at that time, I'm not a psychologist. I'm a neuroanatomist in my background. So I heard about this phenomenon called the Coca-Cola Effect. You know this one?
Which is
where
not
there
real.
was a rumor that you show people subliminal, very fast stimuli, they go and buy Coca-Cola in the intermission. And I said, wow.
Okay, but just to make sure that everyone knows that it's not real, right? So people don't go and get Coca-Cola after they're being flashed with Coca-Cola images.
So with Kalanit, I said, hey, let's see what happens when we are showing things subconsciously. We'll find the Coca-Cola effect. My wife is a psychoanalyst, so I said, I'm studying the subconscious of Freud. You know, so she ran this backward masking experiment in the fMRI and doing it, with sometimes you don't see it, sometimes you see. Zero activation in the methods we had then, not MVPA and all that, just univariate activation. You don't see something, the ball goes to nothing compared to just the random dots. And the moment you start seeing it, you see a beautiful activation. There was a complete correlation between the bold activation in high order visual cortex and the ability of subject to see, including training.
I remember
at that
the
time
figure.
I was completely, I said, that's it. Activity is consciousness, and we have finished the business. And I wanted, just to tell you the landscape, we wanted to call the paper that we publish eventually conscious signature of perception in the human brain. And somebody, I will not mention their name, told me, don't dare to say consciousness. It will not be accepted. It will be rejected. Say recognition performance. Now, it tells you something very important, what mileage we did. At that time, you were not allowed to talk about subjective experience. It was mushy, not not clear. So you had to phrase things that we now will call conscious experience by words that are related to behaviorism, basically, and recognition.
And that was the only kind of instance of skepticism or warnings to go into this field that you encountered, or were there more?
Okay, so that's great, because I want to tell you about another failure that completely changed the way I was thinking. So after having this, finding this effect of the object versus textures, I was still completely dominated, and I think our field of visual recognition was dominated by the ideas of Keiji Tanaka. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. The idea is that basically you recognize object because of elements. He called them moderately complex elements. And just to illustrate this idea, for those who are not familiar, there was a cover of Nature showing responses of a neuron in IT cortex of monkey that responds identically to a face with red lips and a tomato, red pepper that had red lips of the same kind. And the idea is, here you have a neuron responding identically to a face and to a pepper because the moderately complex lips-like structure are identical in these two cases. I was completely dominated by this idea, and I was sure all this, including my results, were all related to these elements. And I had this, again, great idea how I'm going to kill all the people who claim about category representation, all that, it's all elements.
Kill them metaphorically.
Metaphorically.
Okay.
And the idea was, again, very simple, use the famous illusion called the Rubin vase face illusion. You have a face and a profile which basically don't change in terms of the local features. You can induce by a little trick sometimes the subject to see the profiles and sometimes to see the vase. We sat with Uri Hasson, and I said, here I'm going to show you that it doesn't matter if you see a face or a vase, the activity will be the same. We'll be finished with all this business of psychology, categorical and all that. We sent an abstract to the Society for Neuroscience based on initial result, saying we didn't find any difference between seeing a face and seeing a vase. And I remember sitting with Uri Hasson in the lab. He's looking at the result and he says, Rafi, the brain doesn't tell us this. The brain is telling us the opposite. It turns out that every time somebody sees the profiles, the FFA is activated. The moment they switch to seeing a vase, the FFA is lowering the activation. Very robust effect, completely contradictory to my prediction. We rushed a correction for the abstract where we in fact said exactly the opposite of what we said. And I got completely converted to the idea that it's not a feed forward, it's not an element representation, it's a holistic gestalt representation. And the more we studied it, the more it becomes clear that high order visual areas are related to your perceptual gestalt experience and not to some kind of a feed forward V1-like elements that are driving it. And I think this is where I really started understanding that it has to do something with our perceptual experience rather than with the feed-forward information coming from the retina.
So
but I want to hear some of your...
of my failures?
Yeah, I want to interview you.
Okay. I'm not that interesting, I'm afraid. I do have many failures, though. But just to go back to the story that you were telling, I know that I promised not to ask anything about the mind, the brain and mind, body, and so on. But still, I was wondering. So you were telling a story about how your thinking changed when you saw the data. Like the brain talked to you and gave you some new way of thinking at things. Do you think that your conception of consciousness changed after, is it 40 years of?
No, not 40 years. I mean, I think I really explicitly started all this. I told you, I would say in retrospect, it was a subconscious process, just like Ran said, leading to suddenly saying, and I remember actually talking to a good friend of mine, Carl Olson, that I want to study consciousness. He said, are you crazy? This is never going to lead anywhere. So he still thinks that I'm wasting my time today.
4 science papers later.
But I said, and then I started thinking, and I'm sure everybody here started who are interested in consciousness went through the same process, because the first thing you think about conscious, you say, I'm conscious about. What does it mean that I'm conscious? And then immediately you get to what Roy said, this recurrent self within self within self, and your mind starts buzzing, and you don't know how to proceed. And I said, what's going on? I cannot even think what consciousness is, until I suddenly had this insight, which we actually developed further, that in fact you can be conscious without thinking about the fact that you're conscious. You know, I know it's controversial and there's a lot of arguments on that, but the basic thing, you have the insight of sitting in a movie, being totally absorbed by the action. I think everybody here goes to the movie and pays money not to fall and become unconscious because you're so absorbed in the movie, but because you are most intensely involved with the movie. So basically you can think about experiential cases where we are completely in the sort of experience or the sensory experience, whatever, without having all these loops of am I seeing, am I understanding that I'm seeing, am I aware that I'm aware, and all that. And that allowed me finally to try to figure out, you know, how can you be conscious without getting all these layers of metacognition and sort of being aware that you are aware. And that was actually the first experiment that we are explicitly addressing the issue of consciousness. And basically, fortunately, what we found, and this is still, I think, debated, but in our hand, that when you are really absorbed in the perception, in the movie, or in the very fast activity, and you are not considering all these issues, am I aware right now and all that, you actually get a suppression of the networks that are involved in self-representation, all the networks that Roy talked about. So in fact, that was very helpful, because if they were activated a little bit, then you have a problem of interpretation. But the moment you see suppression, you realize that in fact there is a sort of swing or balance between being sort of consciously experiencing the outside world and consciously experiencing yourself in the act of experiencing the world, and they are actually canceling each other. And that was, to me, a very helpful insight that sort of allowed me to follow on this issue and study it in
No, but it's interesting also with respect to the manifesto we've heard today, because you keep describing a situation where you had an insight, and then you went to the magnet to test it. And what I'm asking is, was there a case where the results changed the way you think about consciousness, or is it only a matter of how consciousness is related to neural activity? Did it change the way you think about the phenomena itself? I'm wondering.
The truth is, and probably I conveyed it, the truth is I don't consider myself expert on the issue, philosophical for sure, no, but even the issue of what conscious is. And the obsession I have is the relationship between this jelly, the brain, and the phenomenal appearance or emergence of phenomena out of neuronal activity, brain activity. The link between the brain and the mind, that is what I'm interested in. I don't think I have much to inform the respected audience here about what is exactly the nature of consciousness, what does it do. I am interested in the bridge. Now, the fundamental experimental result that changed my view about it is the one I told you. When suddenly I realized that high-order visual areas are actually representing conscious perception, and they are not representing inputs that are fed in from the retina. To me, that was mind-changing. I was not at that time talking in terms of conscious experience, but in retrospect, I say this was the place where I suddenly sort of had the insight that all these perceptual phenomena are not something very subtle that will maybe happen in the frontal cortex, all that. They happen right in front of our eyes in a major way in high-order visual cortex. And visual cortex is actually interested in our conscious perception, not in our stimuli or whatever. And I think that actually changed my complete thinking about it in retrospect. Consciously, it came a bit later.
By the way, if anyone has questions, then feel free to... okay, great.
Yes.
So how do you explain the failure of the inversion of the manifest
Excellent question. Actually, I'm not sure we know it for sure. Actually, your talk hinted at it. I think the areas that we call the high order visual areas are actually not involved in recognition. Nowadays, I think they are involved more in perception, in the sense of how things look like, but not about recognizing the identity of a particular person, regardless of the different viewpoint. I think this probably is conducted in further downstream areas, maybe even hippocampus, maybe entorhinal cortex. And I think MRI has limitations that we were not aware at the time. It cannot record from certain areas that are close to the ears or whatever, but it also, and that's very important I assume most people understand it, you cannot record with fMRI phenomena that are not organized anatomically in clusters. Because fMRI is a low resolution method, it cannot record single units. So if you have a mixture of neurons, some of them responding to upright, sometimes responding to inverted, fMRI as it is will not be able to detect it. MVPA might touch it. We try to propose a method that is indirect using adaptation effects. But the fact is, if you really want a robust, strong signal, you have to have an area in which this is anatomically clustered. And the high order visual areas do not have this kind of resolution.
So I want to take you back to one of the things you said before, which is it's a great question and it's mind-boggling, but we probably won't be able to solve it. And this took me back to a famous bet that took place between Christoph Koch and David Chalmers. I think it was 23 years ago. And back then, Christoph said that within 25 years, we will solve the heart problem, I think, or something like it. We'll solve consciousness. So we have 2 more years to do it. I want to ask you, A, if you think, not if it will be within 2 years, within 20 years, within 50 years, never. Do you have like a hunch, a bet?
First of all, I have to share, I watched Christoph Koch in a debate in a YouTube, and he was so hostile to the idea that maybe we will never solve the heart problem that thank God he's not here in the audience, because he really sort of addressed the person who proposed this idea as, you know, somebody silly and doesn't know what he's talking about. And obviously, science will move forward and will solve the problem. And, you know,
he believes it.
Yeah, he believes it.
Sure.
And we have examples, and it was mentioned, you know, live, for example. We have examples where we thought a phenomena is very mysterious, and science allowed us to gradually understand it. So now we don't think there's a big mystery. It's possible. I'm definitely not going to predict, but there is a deep difference between explaining an external phenomena and explaining my own subjective experience. I think how I feel, how I see, and how I experience feels to me like a problem of a completely different category, but it's complete intuition. In 5 years, Lucia will do an experiment that I'll say, wow, it explains it all. So,
but yeah, sure.
yeah.
She already did the experiment.
Well, we discussed it in these 5 months of, by the way, this is an opportunity to say it was a fantastic period, and Ran and Leon, despite the fact that they put me here on the hot chair, really deserve all the credit, and of course my friend, the other friends in the group. So we had fantastic time discussing it, and my personal view is that we have this amazing toolkit that was developed for mice, for rodents. I think sooner or later, for the young crowd this time, sooner or later this will be implemented medically, because it's so powerful that things like maybe epilepsy and other aspects could be dealt with.
You're
The
talking about
moment we have
optogenetics, just to understand.
optogenetics, and there's a zillion other tools, I don't even know all the names of them. The moment you can combine them with a reporting human being that can tell you what they experience, that will be a game changer, and I think many of the questions that we are struggling with will be solved in no time. I think methodology, at least in my experience with the fMRI, methodology is the way, the only way to really understand what the brain is trying to tell us, so we can sit and speculate and argue, and then one clever experiment with one new technique will be completely changing our views and changing the theories, and will move us forward. Well, we discussed this. Actually, Liad gave us a very nice introduction that we must move to the natural world. We must sort of try to understand how ecological conscious experience is related to brain activity. We're a little bit too limited to the lab situation, although maybe unlike Liad, I think there is a lot of value to complementing one with the other.
The same here.
But I think if you are asking this rich thing of using movies, I mean, Nick gave this beautiful presentation, using movies, use naturalistic stimuli. Suddenly, again, it's another tool. It opens up a new dimension that we are not aware of. We are back to emotions because no, and I think it's nice. I don't think a scientist. I'll tell you to the young students what I can tell what I tell my students. If you go to sleep without being obsessed about the question you are studying, then I think maybe you should think otherwise. It's all starting and ending with emotion, with burning desire of curiosity, and this is not a rational thing. So I think if scientists decide they don't feel the burning desire to pursue more what life is, probably there is some kind of message there that is maybe subconscious, maybe wrong, maybe it will re-emerge again as a question, but still the burning desire about consciousness that I have is part of it is the feeling that it's not going to be solved in a trivial way. It's going to really, if there is even an answer, it will blast our mind the moment we understand it. And even if not, just moving towards this impossible goal is I think, very exciting to me, very satisfying sort of endeavor.
Definitely.
Well, the answer immediately is absolutely yes. In other words, my background in neuroanatomy was crucial to the way I'm thinking about consciousness. But you know, you always have to be careful. Maybe you're doing this Marxist thing of justifying, rationalizing your crazy career, because I really started by doing track tracing in monkeys, and now I'm doing some kind of psychological creativity studies and resting state. And maybe I need some rationalization. But the fact is that looking at these neurons and looking at the neuronal connection, and for example, very simple thing, realizing that the massive element in cortical function is lateral connectivity. This is something, it just glares in your eyes. That must influence the way you're thinking. So you immediately think, okay, if it is so powerful and it is so massive, it must be doing something, and it fits into your ideas. On the other hand, I had an existential crisis doing neuroanatomy in the following sense. I started looking in the microscope, looking at these connections, I mean, unbelievable complexity is an understatement, what you see. There's no rule, nothing fits with any pattern that is more than just a gradual, very vague trend. And you sit there and say, how on earth I'll ever be able to make any sense of it? And what saved me from this existential crisis is this. At that time, we are not talking about the new deep learning revolution. At that time was a previous wave of some kind of a network. How do they call them? Parallel distributed processing and all that. And then suddenly the idea came, and maybe Chaim, maybe you were a part of it, by now I have too many years. But the idea came that you don't need to understand every single fiber, where it's going and how it's connected. It's not logical gates in a computer. It's some kind of a statistical machine that maybe by training, by backpropagation and all that, you get from it some kind of interesting behavior. And that was sort of easy, because then I could look just at statistics. What is the probability that two areas will be connected and so forth. And that sort of took out the burden of trying to figure it out as if it is a computer. It's interesting that now we are encountering it from the point of view of computer people when they are facing the deep learning, because I'm, of course, my department is very close to the applied mathematics department, and I hear students of Shimon Ullman and all that, and you see how this original vision of having an algorithm or some kind of clever, loops or whatever recursive algorithm will actually solve all this problem. And suddenly you come with this basically biologically looking networks, in the sense that nobody is planning any algorithm there. They sort of learn by mistakes, and maybe eventually we will discover some algorithm, but right now we don't have them. You look, it's complete mess. Each neuron is doing something completely different, and at the end they recognize faces better than humans can do. And I think this is a somewhat existential crisis for people that believe that a computer program, in a simple sense, in the mathematical sense, will solve all these problems. And I think that's an interesting sort of parallel to what I underwent as a neuroanatomist many years ago.
Chava, you wanted to?
I think any perspective that you are trying, because the problem is so intractable and so interesting and so deep, any perspective, including, for example, I'm not trying to be... I think study of your kind... study of your kind is illuminating, in the sense it adds interesting information. I'm not sure I'm agreeing with you that these specific functions are related to consciousness, but just understanding, all the way from C. elegans even, starting to understand, because somebody told me in my department, somebody who's studying C. elegans, she claims they have free will, in the sense that there is a neuron there that has a completely stochastic behavior that you cannot predict. It does not deterministic. So who knows? Maybe you could study free will in C. elegans. I'm open-minded. I'm not trying to be imposing. I think we can learn from any different interesting approach. And I think talking about what is the promising avenue, I think it's even wrong to think this way. We should be open-minded, and maybe some crazy studying of an algae, like produced optogenetics, some studying of unrelated brain area that we didn't even think about it, will turn out to be very important. So I think we should be really open-minded and creative, and listen to the brain, what we get from the brain in terms of activity, and the brain should teach us, of course, against our theories and predictions, in which direction to go. A little bit we played with with the coma patient, because we are interested at that time. Okay, so I'll tell you in another
Failure?
problem. No, it's a big problem, and I'm not sure we solved it yet. And this is a problem called resting state fluctuation. You probably all know. I want to tell you how we discovered them in the visual system, because it's another lesson to students, I think. So basically, we are having the typical experiment. We use projector. Your subject lies in the magnet. Fortunately, she was a very, very motivated student. She lies in the magnet, and we are supposed to project faces, houses, tools, whatever. The classic mapping experiment. So Yuval Nir, who is running the experiment, at the end of about 12 minutes of this, he asked her, so how was the stimuli? And she said, I'm waiting for the experiment to start. It turns out the light bulb burned, and she was lying there 12 minutes in the darkness. Fortunately, she was a very good, sort of memushma, disciplined student, didn't move. So we have 12 minutes in the dark. So I said, dump it and turn the bulb, and let's continue with the experiment. And Yuval, at the end, he said, wait a minute. It's an opportunity to see what happens in the visual system when you don't see anything. And I was sure there will be nothing or some noise. And then we discovered in the visual system the famous resting state fluctuation, which was incredibly difficult to publish at the time, because we were confronted with a wall of physicists arguing this is all artifact of blood oscillation. By the way, till today, there are many people who don't believe fMRI because it's all a blood artifact. But showing resting state that was not tied to any task was incredibly difficult. It took long time to publish by showing connectivity. The connectivity immediately proves to you that it cannot be blood. The blood is not organized by cross-hemispheric correlations. So this was a very exciting finding on the one hand, but on the other hand, how can you explain these fluctuations in complete darkness? Subject does not report that they are imagining anything, they don't engage in imagery, and you can do controls to show that imagery is not the relation. And here you have fluctuation while you are believing that high activity in these areas is related to conscious perception. Here we have a completely contradictory results. And we try to argue that it has to do with the distribution. In other words, if the activity is localized, you are conscious. If it is widespread, you are not conscious. And this is, I think, still an issue to discuss and think about it. But resting state fluctuation was like a sort of a problem for a simplistic thinking about consciousness. And of course, now Leon gave us another very difficult argument against activity correlates to consciousness with this adaptation phenomena that are so powerful. You see the signal going down 80%, and the subject is, as far as we can tell, is not aware of any change in the person. Each one is a genius, so no.
So 12 of them are PIs now, so it's pretty amazing the generation.
Well, I was fortunate to get good students. So difficult. I can tell you about emotion. Can tell you about emotions, because I think this is the most important. First of all, be incredibly motivated and curious. Second, very important, have a huge ego when you are against the community. In other words, in the following sense, you are discovering something very important and very powerful. You did all the controls. You are convinced that it is correct. All the community is saying this is bullshit, this is a waste of time, you are crazy. Ignore them. Just continue and push what you found and what you believe in, and eventually people will agree. So you need a huge ego when you are... Courage. But I say ego to contrast it with a humility. You need to have, as I described, I try to convey it, when you are facing the results of the experiments. If the brain is, you come with this fantastic theory, beautiful, everything is so elegant. All you need is the voxels to confirm it, and the voxels don't want to confirm it. What can you do? Now, there are two possibilities. You insist, you do p-hacking, you try, you go publicly and tell about an effect of, barely visible, or you say, maybe the brain is telling me something. Let's think in a different way. Let's try in a different direction. Tell me what I learned from this failure. And I think facing the brain, zero don't fall in love with your ideas. Facing the community, if you are sure that you're right, of course, listen, read papers, be open to criticism, but if you see a lot of time, I feel that there are a lot of notions are established that it's okay to question them, including my notions. I mean, no problem about it, and I want to sort of show that if somebody will come and show me that I'm completely wrong, and Leon with the adaptation to some extent demonstrated it, I need to take it like a man or like a woman, as they say.
So I was wondering how you think if one day we'll have a theory of brain and mind, what will this look like?
Well, the dream is, the fantasy I have is, it's actually, it's so vulgar that I feel embarrassed, but I'll say it. The idea is that there will be one law, one principle, like Schrödinger equation of quantum mechanics, that will be able, or like Darwin's two principles, that will take the entire world of conscious experience, smell, love, seeing faces, urge to move, thoughts, will take all of them and put them under one principle. In other words, I apply this principle, I can know that whether you are conscious, and it should apply to all possible consciousness. In other words, it must be a common principle. And I have this ongoing argument with Leon that says this is impossible, no, never it will happen. I believe this is really what should motivate us, to find an elegant theory, elegant principle that will account for all conscious phenomena. The moment we have it, then we can go to the animal kingdom and say, can we find this principle along the evolutionary tree, and maybe that will be a way to figure out what conscious is and what conscious is not. But this is just almost like solving the hard problem. So I think we are very, very many years away from this principle. But this is the dream, to reduce highly complex, endlessly rich universe into a simple principle that will explain it.
I just wanted to remark on Chaim's remark that the question of what is life is not interesting. So I think it's not interesting because it's wrong. When I was around when it was a very interesting question. I don't know if anybody else in the room was around. It was a very interesting question, and exactly what you said just now about one principle solving it, that's DNA. The discovery of DNA, that's it. That's all of life. And we understand life since then. And we know what it is, yes. And there will be maybe
So I think we have 10 more minutes.
Excellent. Basically, you're asking whether this principle will solve what we call the hard problem, in other words. And we don't know. Like, maybe we'll see the principle and say, now it's obvious why red is red and green. Or we'll see the principle, like in quantum mechanics, by the way, if I understand them correctly, I'm not a physicist. You have the Schrödinger equation, but nobody can make sense out of it. In other words, you have all these problems on conflicting interpretations. They try to say, what does it actually say? Does thing exist? Don't exist? What is probability? So we might have the principle, and we'll be still scratching our head and saying, okay, I have this principle. I can tell that whenever this thing happens, the person will say I'm conscious when it's not, is not conscious, but does not explain to me how I see the the sunset on Gordon Beach in Tel Aviv, you know. So we don't know. Like maybe DNA solved life, and this principle will solve the hard problem, or maybe not. The truth is, I cannot even imagine under all scenarios how the hard problem will look like, how solving the hard problem will go about, because it's really true that I'm still amazed by the fact that seeing you is just a bunch of electricity running between neurons. I mean, it's to me, it's amazing. I mean, you try to touch this electricity, you barely feel it, but when it happens in your visual cortex, I see Udi Zohari. What's going on here?
So let me ask you specifically about this question. So I think one of the things that is amazing to see in the way you talk is how passionate you are about it and how this really fascinates you. So do you think, is there any chance, let's go with your optimism. Maybe one day someone will solve the hard problem. Do you think it will take away the magic now?
The question is, what is the solution? Usually in science, you look at the history of science, you see that any discovery, quantum mechanics is the best example. You know, we had physics from the Greeks. I think it was pretty boring. You know, the world is just the way it is. I know I shouldn't talk. Where is Yuval? He's not. The world is just as it is. It's all blocks, atoms, whatever. And then quantum mechanics comes and gives a description of the world that is totally counterintuitive. So sometimes science, by discovering, make things even more magical, more interesting, more wonderful. So I hope the moment we have if we have the solution to consciousness, it will open up even more astonishing and interesting questions. I'm optimistic that science will never become boring. That's it. Mike. So the word explain here is critical, because what I'm having in quantum mechanics, I'm not sure you can say that you explain water and explain light and explain all the other phenomena that quantum mechanics deals with. I think what quantum mechanics is fantastic for, and also special relativity and so forth, is by having some kind of a law that applies to all these phenomena. I'm not sure you can apply the word explain them, but they are sort of predicting them or describing them in an elegant manner. So I'm not now in the program, I don't believe, as I said, it's an open question, will it ever be there. I cannot even conceive of experiment that will solve the hard problem, but I am in the program of finding the law, the bridging law, that will bridge between some kind of neuronal state and the fact that people are conscious or non-conscious. And I think this bridging law could be, I believe, it is a uniform law. It applies to all systems in the brain. We don't know what it is, but we are making progress. There, I think we are making a lot of progress. And I think we'll have a jump, quantum jump, if we have optogenetics and all these tools that could be applied to the conscious human mind. And there, you know, finding some principle, some theory, you can call it a theory of consciousness in the sense of bridging on saying, whenever I have this kind of principle happening in the visual cortex, I see Mike Shadland. When it happens in the auditory cortex, I hear Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and so forth. There, I think it's a manageable project, and that's what I have in mind.
Consciousness
So my answer is very simple. I work from the gut, not from the head. And the question is, what I find burning, interesting question. The engineering question do not interest me. And I completely agree that every system will have a very clever engineering approach to solving this problem. How we move our eyes is very interesting and you know, it requires a lot of understanding. I really I'm more excited by Schrödinger equation than by understanding how a car works. Despite the fact that maybe underneath it's all quantum mechanics, but it's a matter of taste. You know, I'm burning with this question. What all, you know, every part, there's such a huge universe of different things that we can do. Some of them are conscious and some of them are not. And what's burning to me is to try to figure out why we are crossing this boundary. How exactly we are digesting food and how we move our eyes and how we detect. I might be completely wrong, and it might be that this, your way, is actually the way to answer my question. But the gut feeling is I want to go directly after the question of conscious versus non-conscious, and everything else to me is an engineering that I personally am less interested in. That's
So now for the really actual final question.
oh my goodness.
So this is a secret event, right? So I think it's only appropriate that you reveal some secret. And I was told by some of your lab members that there's a secret thing in the lab which relates to a green spark.
Ah, that's well. It's not a secret. I mean, I'm sure people know about it. No, how many of you know about the green flash? By the way, there is a movie. Stan, you must know about it. There is a French movie that was done on this phenomenon by Eric Romer, I think. The green flash. Next time you're, yeah, well, maybe Stan, you need to tell us about it. I'll tell you an experience. Okay, so you want to describe it or? Okay. Yeah. In Israel sometimes, so next time you're on I like the sunsets. I highly recommend as a way, when they reject your papers, it's perfect way to. So if you happen to be on the beach during sunset, it does not always work so dramatically as in Israel. I heard it in the tropics, it's much more powerful. But sometimes, exactly like Stan described, watch the sun. Don't watch directly all immediately because when it's strong, because then you'll have an after image. Look a bit to the side. The last moment, you'll suddenly see the color change. Well, now, why is it nice? Because first of all, it forces you to enjoy the sunset to the full. And secondly, it's a wonderful kind of entertainment for a crowd. And I'll tell you what, we had a visitor, a very famous mathematician coming to the Weizmann, and I was asked to take her to a restaurant, and we took this restaurant on the beach in Tel Aviv, and I told about the green flash, and she was attending, and this famous scientist that I heard, she's made many breakthroughs in science, started jumping up like a kid and saying, I saw it, I saw it, I saw it. So this is worth finishing with.
So I just said, like, personal note. I remember when I started, I also, and I remember when I was looking for how much information, they told me no one's doing consciousness in Israel, maybe.
The speakers we convene downstairs at actually in 7 minutes. 10 minutes.
Doesn't work. Oh, it does work. Speakers in the conference. Speakers in the conference. לא שומעים אותו.